Welcome to Courageous Leaders, the flagship podcast of Ibec's new Open for Business campaign. I'm Cara McGann, Head of Skills and Social Policy at Ibec. We're living in a moment of distinct tension. While Ireland has benefited immensely from decades of social and economic progress, we're seeing the cracks appear. Divisive narratives are building in our communities and online, threatening the very stability that allows both people and businesses to thrive. At Ibec, we believe business cannot be a bystander, but knowing how to act, how to build cohesion rather than division, requires a specific set of skills. My guest today has spent a lifetime mastering those skills, often on the front lines of Ireland's most defining social changes. Ailbhe Smyth is a name that needs little introduction, but her resume demands recognition. An academic, a radical feminist, and an LGBTQ+ activist, she was the founding head of Women's Studies at UCD and a founding member of Marriage Equality. Most recently, she was a co-director of the Together for Yes campaign, earning her a spot on the Time 100 list of most influential people. She knows how to change minds, and today we're going to ask, what can business learn from a radical activist about holding the line against hate? Ailbhe, welcome to Courageous Leaders.
Thank you very much, Cara. I'm very, very pleased and delighted really to be here talking about this. It's unusual enough for me to be in such direct conversation about business. So
Yes.
It's an adventure for me to be talking with you today.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure to have you with me. I suppose looking at your bio, from the Feminist Open Forum to the Repeal campaign, you've spent a career fighting for the margins. And as you say, today we're sitting here discussing the role of business.
Yeah.
And some might see us as strange allies. But maybe to start off, could you tell us how you got into the work that you do?
Well, I suppose it was really timing. I mean, I am now quite advanced in years, and I was a young woman during the 1970s when the women's liberation movement was coming on stream. And also, although I wasn't particularly aware of it at the time, when we also had lesbian and gay, or gay liberation as it was called then. So the 70s were really the great years of social movements. And I was a young woman teaching in UCD, and it gradually struck me, things were coming through to me from afar. I might go to France in the summer. I was in a Department of French Studies, or I'd be over maybe in England for something, or read maybe the newspapers. Television, not so much. I mean, we just watched the news. But I became aware of the women's liberation movement, and I wasn't involved at that point. But I became very conscious of the fact that I was teaching in a university, I was lecturing, but that the vast, vast, vast majority of other lecturers were men, but that I was actually teaching women, young women, in a department of French. And I thought but I was teaching them a curriculum that was all about men. And the penny dropped. Now, it didn't drop overnight. It took me a while. It took me a good few years to begin to connect the dots. And I became involved in the women's movement. So that was, it started with my work experience, if you like, and realizing what was going on in the workplace, which I think was very important, that I wasn't a lone voice as a woman, but it was pretty well. I mean, there were very few of us. And certainly we weren't senior, we weren't professors, we weren't running the place. And in fact, in academic life, we're still not running the place on the whole. But that's where it started. And then the connections with my own lived experience came up to the surface, and I got very annoyed. And I thought, this is about me, but if it's about me, it's also about other women. It's also about women all over the place. So it started there and developed.
Absolutely. And probably a very brave step to be taking in a sense. I mean, while you say it was, there's probably more than you there, at the same time, putting your head above the parapet when, as you say, not in a leadership position necessarily at that point.
Well,
quite the option.
That was, yes. And I mean, I think that's why I always say you don't have to be born an activist. You can develop it. But it certainly helps if you have the kind of temperament that means that you stamp your foot when you see something wrong, something unfair, whether it's about yourself or, even more importantly, actually, I think about someone else or another group of people, and you're prepared not to let it go without comment, that you're going to call it out, that you're going to say, this is not right. And my mother certainly used to say, she's dead now, of course, but she used to say, oh, well, you always had a terrible temper. Okay. Now, I hope I don't have that temper anymore, although it can still come through at times, I think. But it has stood me in very good stead, because that temper always, I can feel it coming up when I see something that I consider to be an injustice. I can feel that little red ball of rage in there. And people may think that's childish, but it's been with me as part of my temperament. So I'm not sure that I was brave. I think I was more angry and annoyed, and that helped me to speak. But I did have to find my voice. And because, I am a woman, that's hard. It's hard for us as women still, I think, to find our voice. And maybe it's my generation, but my voice, I sometimes wonder, is it going to fail me, or will it still be there? I don't mean physically, although, of course, I do worry about that too. But I mean, and I think that's something really important, that the difference in confidence between women and men, girls and boys, I can even see it in my granddaughter and my grandson, that differential is still surprisingly there after, what is it now, 50, 60 years of feminism and the women's movement. So we have by no means, never mind not solving the economic problems and a lot of the social problems, but that our educational systems, not just in Ireland, I mean, we're talking about the world here really, that there is still that sort of power differential gap that somehow is built into our education systems. That means that girls tend to, have that bit less confidence. Boys will appear to sail through life.
It is. It's so interesting how we're socialised so differently, even still, as you say.
Yes.
When you think we've come a long way since the marriage bar and everything in between, and as you say, the feminist movement. So if I think about, the breadth of your career, a lot of it has focused on fighting for the margins and building broad coalitions. And I suppose if I think about Together for Yes or Lekela, how can those approaches serve maybe as a blueprint for businesses seeking social cohesion, which is something that is so important at this time?
Well, I would say, first of all, that, my experience as an academic and as an activist has not really brought me much into contact with business and how it functions, although I do come from a very business-oriented family, actually. But so I'm not terribly sure that I am the right person to know how it would work for business. But I do, I am very firmly convinced, and, it just came to me, I suppose, over a very long time, and it's a view that's shared by very many people, that the more unity and the more solidarity you can actually create to achieve whatever your aim happens to be, and I'm talking in terms of social justice and of equality, that the more unified you can be in your approach, the greater your chance is of succeeding. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily going to win every time. And in fact, most of my life, we won in small little bits here and there. And suddenly we got two great big dollops with marriage equality and then later repeal of the eighth at once. But I do think that, I always go back to the Irish saying, Níneart go gur le céile, that in fact we really are stronger together. And we know that. I mean, we know that from our national struggles. We know that from looking at national struggles elsewhere in the world. We know that from our own, I certainly know that from campaigns I've been involved with over the years, that the broader, the wider, the more you can make something work as a sort of a vehicle, the larger your vehicle, the further it's going to bring you, and the more people are going to be involved. And I can't not I can't see how that isn't important in business, because in
Yes.
many ways, I mean, obviously that can be built in and is built in to many businesses, where you need to create a committed workforce who are, who are really committed to achieving the aims of the company, and to do so willingly, because they're being well looked after, because they're properly and fairly and equally paid, because there is a sense of care about the workforce, because they are valued and respected and treated with dignity, and so on and so forth. And that businesses, I like to think, that actually observe those kinds, that build in those values of every single person being a valued member of a team, that really is the principle of building strong unity and strong coalitions. You don't achieve that overnight. Of course, you have to work
Yes.
to
Yeah.
build it. But I do think that if it's possible in the big wide world of activism, it's not just possible in business, it is actually there already, but not
Yeah.
always observed, not always understood for what it
Mm.
is and why it's so important.
And I think one area maybe that stands out a little bit around this, as you say, that we're stronger together, and that approach. In Together for Yes, you had to unite people who didn't necessarily agree on everything.
Mm-hmm.
You'd radical activists, conservative medics maybe, but they agreed on one thing.
Yes.
And I guess in business, we have extremely diverse workforces with different political views. That art of coalition building, that uniting maybe unlikely allies,
Yes.
and the strategies that you took with that around care, compassion, change. Is there anything that you feel business could think about in that regard? Because, as I say, our populations are getting more diverse.
Yes.
Our stakeholders are certainly more diverse.
Well, I think, first of all, it's probably important to recognize and to value diversity in itself, and not to see it ever as a threat, but rather as the grounds for possibility and potential, and also um, for being both socially and culturally genuinely enriching. That if you have diverse viewpoints, this can be extremely creative and bring great energy into whatever it is you're doing, whether that's whatever kind of campaign it is, whether it's a business campaign or whether it's a political campaign or whatever. So I think that even just that word diversity in itself is something to say, oh, that's great. We're not all like-minded here. We don't all think the same way, because if we all think the same way, we're never going to think about new things. There'll be no innovation. There'll be no creativity. There'll be no imagining the world differently. And, as far as I can see, business needs to be able to imagine the world differently, just as much as everybody else, if not more. I mean, we all have to be able to understand this. And in order to do that, you need people who are not of like mind, but who are able to come together or to be brought together. And that's maybe where certain kinds of leadership come in. So you're looking at ways of talking to people, of working with them to understand that it's important to agree on your main aim, your purpose, but that apart from that, you don't have to go and disagree about every single thing you disagree. That for the purposes of the campaign, of whatever kind it is, you agree that this is what you want to achieve, and that you agree that you will work together. If you don't have the relationships in business, you might as well lock your doors and go home today. You've got to build your relationships. And I think that we often miss those points, and we think there's some kind of magic bullet. This is always about people and working with people, encouraging, promoting, pushing, pulling sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
And also, from time to time saying, you're not going to bring everybody with you all the way. That's all right. People also have the right to go their own way. But we don't need to do it with anger. We don't need to do it with hatred. We don't need to do it with discourtesy. We can do it by saying, we are parting ways now. We disagree and we accept that.
Yes.
I've always thought to myself, and maybe this is where something like maybe care and compassion, I think just being aware of what you don't want people to do to you, being aware that that is not something you're going to do to them. So I'm always aware that I don't want people to try and persuade me out of long-held views
Yes.
that I have about the world. But I also actually respect that in them. And while I may make an attempt to do that, that's in my nature, is to try to persuade.
Yeah.
I will also recognize when someone is committed and dedicated, and there may even at times be a grudging respect, even if I disagree.
Yes.
That's not true for everyone, because there are hateful views in the world which I will always condemn. But the care, compassion and change, that was very important for us, because in the repeal campaign, we were asking people to think differently about something that they thought they disapproved of.
Yes.
And we wanted to say to them, think about the people that we're talking about here. And what we're talking about is generally women who need something that you think you disapprove of, that is an abortion in this particular case. We want you to think about walking in their shoes, which was a lovely campaign that a group ran actually during repeal. And just to have that compassion to say, what if I were in that situation? And if you can't quite imagine that, to say, who am I if I can't even imagine it? Who am I to stop someone, to prevent someone? I can at least understand that there is distress or need or desire, whatever it is, and to work on that basis, because quite simply, we do care what happens to other people. So they were very strong humanitarian kinds of messages that we had. But obviously, we thought long and hard about what it was we had to do. How would be the best way to move people from something they had doubts about, reservations, distaste, whatever it was. How could we turn that around so they could see it in a very different light? So we had to go back to values and say, do you value people? Do you value having a real empathy and an understanding for the difficult situations that we can as human beings face? And do we fundamentally want to obstruct one another or to support? So we were making that kind of appeal. So you have to think about what it is you're trying to move people towards. And that's the way you bring them with you then.
I think you've two very interesting points there. One is that respect piece. We don't all have to have the same view of the world, but we definitely need that respect piece in place.
Yes.
But also, to your point, that human element, we see it with when we have done work over the years around mental health. Having the human story is very different than the data or the fear people often, because oftentimes some of this comes from fear.
Oh, mostly our reservations about things. We're afraid of things, and fear is so fundamental to our human nature. But so is courage.
Well, that's very true.
And so is change.
Yeah.
So we're constantly changing, and we are. One of the things that I've always said about Ireland, certainly, and certainly over my lifetime, is that people are much better. People are very aware. People are very well informed, very well educated. And one of the reasons I think why, all kinds of reasons why Ireland has done well of late. Let's hope that continues. But it is because people are really well educated and well informed. And we can always improve. There are huge improvements necessary. But, that being said, more so than in many other places. But that level of information and education makes people really quite aware, and aware that we still have those fears with us, but aware that other people may have them as well.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I do think that it's quite interesting. Ireland's quite an interesting space in that regard,
And an
because
interesting time in Ireland, I
very
think.
interesting time. And, now that we're in such a very worrying time, worrying for everybody. I mean, a time of instability and volatile change such as we have now isn't good for anyone. And I can't believe that it's good for business, because it certainly can't be, which is why business is looking for more cohesion, social cohesion. And I do think that we have to say to ourselves, Irish, we are capable of, I think my real point here is that we are capable, Irish people in this country are capable of being braver than sometimes our leaders recognise. And that is a really important point. So wherever we look in the world, education and information are really important to how people can live their lives. It's a very important understanding for business to have, that the more educated, the better informed a population is, the more successful that society will be.
Yes.
And say that we really have to look at what the information sources are and the education sources are. And just right now, when there is so much misinformation and disinformation going around, I think that business has really a big role to play in actually working to try to ensure to overcome information deficits and the wrongful use of information. I'm obviously talking about social media platforms and so on, quite importantly.
And if I can call out maybe specifically in that area, I mean, as you say, the times we live in, they are certainly interesting, but the social fabric is definitely under pressure. We know that. We're seeing that rise in far-right extremism, the exclusionary rhetoric, as well as racist and homophobic attacks.
Yes.
I suppose against that backdrop, how can business in general move from being a passive observer to an active ally in actually holding the line? And is, I suppose, another issue that we sometimes hear, is doing nothing a form of tacit approval?
Well, doing nothing seems to me to be absolutely the worst possible thing human beings can ever do. Because doing nothing, particularly in the face of really very negative, very bad, often very evil things happening in the world, hateful things happening, which is the case in the world at present. Doing nothing is refraining from taking action to prevent that from happening, to prevent it from spreading. So to my mind, that is a moral failure. And I think to myself, that when I think about business, as obviously I do, I want to see a world where we don't have the vast chasms between very great wealth on the one hand and really quite extreme poverty, which is growing in many parts of the world on the other, and also layers of people who really have barely enough to get by on. Of course, I want to see an end to all of that. I want to see that very, very powerfully. And I think business does have a role to play in that. That profit is the motive for business, but is extreme and obscene profit the motive? And what is the cost that we pay in terms of human lives and human flourishing, in terms of the health of our planet, in terms of the future of the world? When I think about AI and technology, when I think about all of these challenges that we face at the moment, it seems to me that business needs to have its moral hat firmly on its head and to be saying, no, because we're business people doesn't mean that we don't have values, doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of moral responsibility, doesn't mean that we haven't regard for and care for the world and people in the world. Of course not. Why should these things be distinct?
Yeah.
And I know that is maybe that's a difficult concept for me even to have got to the point of understanding that myself, and to think it is really important for business not just to be an ally, but to share in the values, the humanitarian values that really matter. How does what we do in our lives, in our work, in our business, how does that contribute to the well-being of human beings? And I know that it might sound like a very goody-goody thing to say, but actually that is what it's about. And when you're an activist, what you are trying to do is, rightly or wrongly, whether people approve or disapprove of you, you are motivated by a desire to change something in the world for the better so that people can live better, happier, more fulfilling lives. None of us, can have 100% happiness. I
Sure.
don't believe in that. But that you could open up spaces. Why would business be denied that? I don't think that business people have no values. I think sometimes, often, frequently, and maybe the bigger the business, the more important it is for it to say, what exactly are our values? Are they fundamentally about people? Are they about people's well-being? And how do we contribute to that? And to be really honest about it, to have that kind of integrity and honesty, and to also look at their employees, their workers, and to say, how do we contribute to the well-being of our employees, and forbidding, narrowing down, saying, oh, well, we won't do equality, diversity and inclusion because that doesn't really suit us politically. On the one hand, you have business saying we never do politics. On the other hand, you have big businesses, big corporations now saying, oh, well, we don't do education, diversity and inclusion because that goes against a very powerful president whom we happen to have in the United States of America at the moment. What kind of contradiction and contradictory speak is that? Either we are in favour of, we have to espouse values which we can stand by, and we then have to implement them. And that, to my mind, is really good for the world as a whole. And whether business people think that's good for profit. But remember, stakeholders can also be driven by really interesting and important values themselves. And I think it is quite interesting at the moment to see how people are looking at different kinds of products, different kinds of services in terms of climate and environment, for example, in terms of war and genocide, in terms of the well-being of children and young people, when we look at technology and social media platforms and phones and so on. And that comes from being better informed, better educated, of having the capacity to ask questions. And I think maybe one of the things that business has to be so aware of, and I'm speaking in a very large sense now, not about any particular kind of business, is that people are beginning to hold big business more to account than ever before, and will continue to do that. So why don't all businesses themselves say, but we hold ourselves to account in the first instance?
Well, let me ask you on that, because there can be a cynicism about business and organisations jumping on bandwagons. We've heard some scepticism or maybe challenges to organisations, for example, marching in the Pride Parade alongside their colleagues and their employees, or sponsoring particular initiatives or going for particular awards, kind of being dismissed as performative. And certainly, I think for some it can feel like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. In a sense. So would you have a sense of what meaningful structural support looks like compared to maybe those performative gestures that could be concerned?
Oh gosh, that's a very difficult question, actually, Cara. I think, just in terms of my own experience, I'm just thinking back to Pride this year, for example, where I think Dublin Pride has been really very interesting in that it has put the emphasis back on Pride as very much a community endeavour, a community project where businesses are welcome to support it, but not to lead it, not to drown it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's easy for big business with more money to drown out the really very creative and often very touching community approach, which is really important. That's what actually brings us together as a community, and a community which reaches out to the straight community, so to speak, and we're all in this together. But I was thinking about it this year, and I watched all of the community. I was sitting because I had bad foot, and I was watching the whole parade, community group after community group. And then we had the businesses, and I was thinking, oh, well, they're all going to have big, big floats and it's going to kind of drown. Not a bit. What really struck me was how pleased and happy the people from the businesses who were out there marching on the street, how happy they were, often with their kids and the buggies and the masks and the face makeup and everything, how pleased and happy they were to be there and to be part of Pride. I've absolutely no idea what they were in terms of sexual or gender identity. Who cared?
Yes.
That wasn't the point. The point was really enjoying themselves. And I thought, no, there is a real value in that. There is a value in a business saying, we don't have to, build some great big float and spend a whole lot of money on it. Money which would be better spent being contributed to community-based groups, not necessarily LGBTIQ, but, whatever, and putting it back into the community for community projects. But allowing people to get out there and basically enjoy themselves, because Pride is as much about the people who work in businesses as anything else. And I would do quite a few Pride talks around, in different businesses. And I love being asked to do those talks because people come to them and they're not only the LGBTIQs, but they always say, I'm so glad you came. It's really great. And I did one, I don't think it's okay to mention it, down with the VHI this year off down in, was it Carlow or Kilkenny? I can't remember which now. And it was absolutely wonderful that the whole place was kind of all decorated, and the people there who are in the LGBT group there actually said, this is a fantastic boost for us. Pride is a great boost. So in a way, it puts it up to the bosses, if you like. It puts it up to management to say, well, okay, give us the wherewithal, give us the resources, give us the support, come along to these events to say and to show, not just to perform, but to really, truly say, all of this matters to us. And of course, there are many different kinds of diversity and inclusion.
Totally,
I was with another company who Pride and their Mixed Heritage Week worked together. So I thought that was really very interesting. It would be a corporate company with a lot of employees from different parts of the world, different ethnicities. And I thought that was so interesting. They were also not just performing, but really valuing and putting that out there on display. And the second answer to your question is that I think everybody always knows when it's just performative and nobody believes it anyway.
Yes,
the workers least of all. Right. And they can see through that in a minute. So there are lots of really strong examples, I think. I did think myself for a long time that EDI was just a kind of a gesture, but I have genuinely seen in quite a lot of spaces that it has opened up space for people who are not part of what would have been seen as the conventional mainstream worker.
Yes.
And that has been really important, whether it's gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, age as well. It can be very, very important if management puts it back into it.
Yeah. I sometimes hear from senior leaders who 100% want to do the right thing, but they are actually afraid of getting it wrong, of using the wrong language, for example, or being accused of tokenism. And on the flip side, you've obviously negotiated with institutions your whole life, whether it's governments or universities or the church, or when an institution like a business, for example, makes a mistake, so perhaps they fumble an EDI initiative,
Yeah.
or, they use the wrong language, they genuinely mess up. What's the path to redemption? Is there space for imperfect allyship in your view?
Everything we do as human beings is imperfect, Cara. So of course
Correct.
there's space for it. And I think the right thing to do in that situation is the right thing to do whenever and wherever you make a mistake, is to come out with your hands up and to say, oh my God, did we ever get that so wrong? We are complete idiots. We apologize. How can we do better? And then to learn from that you listen to what it is people are about. You listen to what it is people want. So if we listen at the moment to what is really wrong with people, why are people so full of hate and anger and viciousness and brutality? Why is that becoming so widespread? It is because there are many reasons, but I think fundamentally there is a real dissatisfaction, there is a real unhappiness, and there is a real anger about the world not being fair, about things not being fair. So it is really important to understand that.
If I can pivot ever so slightly, I suppose I want to look at the why. The Open for Business campaign is very much predicated on the idea that an open society is a prosperous one. And you've alluded to that earlier, as you say, you can't see how, a society that isn't cohesive could be good for business or anybody.
Yeah.
And we would certainly subscribe to that idea. Can you give us a sense of why social justice is not just a nice to have, that it's not a CSR checkbox. It's not one of these adds on that you can then drop, but it's really a bedrock of a stable, of an open society where both individuals and business can thrive. Have you a sense of how we can strongly get that message across?
Well, clearly I'm coming at it from a different perspective. My motive is not to produce something tangible, so to speak. I mean, I want to work with others to try and make the world a fairer and more equal place. So for me, what that requires is greater equality and a greater, trying to reduce what I see as the unfair differences and the discriminations against people.
Sure.
But I see people running businesses, whether they're producing something, whether it's a service, whatever it is, who really want to do right and to have fairness and equality and social justice and the care for what they do and how they do it and who they do it with very firmly at the centre of what they do. And they're admirable. They're admirable. I accept that there might be, in my view, other ways of running a society. But I see them working within the current mode and really working hard to do right. But that always comes back to the fact that they have their values clear. They're clear about what it is they're about and their values. And that while within a capitalist economy, they are going to seek to make a profit for their shareholders, for their stakeholders and so on. But that does not mean trampling over, it does not mean at the expense of people's well-being and lives, that it doesn't mean trampling on people, that it doesn't mean disregarding what is important. It means being ethical. So I would always want to see, and I think it's very important, I always want to see business. I always want to see service. I always want to see education. I always want to see public agencies and services as having a very strong ethical core. So, for me, ethics and politics go together. And in fact, when I was a young student, there was a wonderful man, Father Fergal O'Connor. He was actually a priest who actually taught ethics and politics. And I didn't do ethics and politics because I was a girl and I was sent off to do languages. But I loved knowing the people who were doing, mainly boys, who were doing ethics and politics. And I started reading in that area. So for me, they've always gone together.
Yes.
So I don't like unethical businessmen or women. And I don't like unethical politicians, men or women. And I don't like unethical activists, men or women.
Yes.
We all need to have ethics centrally. And that ethics is an ethics of humanity and what our world is, which at the moment, I think that's a hugely important question. So I would always go back to saying, what are the ethics? What are your business ethics?
Yes.
Because you have to relate those to the planetary ethics. You have to relate those to the technology ethics. You've got to relate those right across the board.
Can I ask you, and this is slightly different, but it's difficult to continuously keep people focused on the end goals. And so sometimes I think we've been talking about inclusion, for example, for so long that there is some fatigue out there about it. And I suppose two questions. With Together for Yes, you had a clear finish line. You had a referendum date.
Yes.
But with the work that you do with Ailbhe, the fight against polarisation doesn't have an end date. So how do you keep a coalition united and persist with the work when there's no election day per se to aim for?
Well, that's very difficult because you're quite right. I mean, you always have to have a target, an aim with a time frame in mind. And actually, most businesses work on that kind of basis. It's all about targets and KPIs, which took me a long time to understand what a KPI was. I do now. A target, a goal is always with the time frame very, very important. And in Ailbhe, which is Ailbhe diversity, not division, we do try to set ourselves specific things to do. So, for example, we quite recently had a rally with music, a sort of carnival type rally against racism and misogyny and trans, hatred and so on. So that's always about you have a long-term project, which is to combat something which is becoming increasingly prominent in our society. But you've got to set specific goals, events, dates, happenings. I'm sure we could do more of that. We're a small group. So you're always looking for keeping people on board by keeping them involved, by keeping them active, by moving things along. If you just think, well, people are going to stay there because they're going to stay with this, they're going to be involved because our overall goal is so big and so important. No, they won't. They won't.
Yes,
You've got to cut it up into bite-sized pieces and to say, well, now, first of all, we're doing this, and then secondly, we're doing that, and thirdly, we're doing the other. And the very best way to involve people is to involve them. That is to give them jobs, get them doing things, get them active, saying this is not going to happen without you. What you're doing is really important. So, I was mentioning about the importance of listening, and also very important in that kind of situation is to say to people, we're doing well, you're doing well, you're doing a great job here. Thank you. This is really great. So encouraging people and asking them to come up with new thinking. So you're doing really well. Have you been thinking about what else we can do here?
Yes.
So if we go back to thinking about diversity and inclusion and equality, it's about not just saying the words, obviously, but what does that really mean? So what does diversity really mean to us in our business, in our place, in our organisation? Have we got enough of it? What would be enough? What is it in the first place? So it's constantly asking the questions and having the moments where people can kind of celebrate and enjoy and go out and be active. And that can sometimes be having people in to do talks, but more often it's people actually organising. And I love, the sort of volunteer type activities that people undertake. I happen to be chair, a great honour of being chair of Women's Aid.
Mm-hmm.
And we have wonderful donors, right across the country. And so many of those companies, the people there, they actually volunteer to do different kinds, to go out and fundraise, to organise things, to think about what they can do. And that's very practical and very, very, very important. Just recently, I was giving a short talk in a company. It's a tech company, I think, actually. And what they did for Christmas was to give everybody a cheque for €50. I don't think it's a very huge company, but €50 seemed to me to be a sizable amount of money for them to spend on a charity of their choice, or an organisation of their choice, or a community project of their choice. I just thought that was a really careful way of thinking about what it means to be inclusive, because it's about saying we need to include the wide world in who we are. We need to think out as much as we think in.
For sure. So
I was asking some of them what they're going to spend their money on. And, well, first of all, they said, oh, well, I've been thinking about what struck me, I think, was they said, oh, I don't know, it's really quite difficult. There's so many things. And several of them said to me, and look, I don't think the 50 is going to be enough. So I'm going to be thrown in a bit of my own now into that. And I thought, wasn't that really wonderful?
Brilliant.
That it was spurring people on to think about what other people need at a time like this.
Which brings me to my final question. Beautifully. How can we remind people, given the divisiveness that's out there, given the intolerance that we're hearing so much more of, and how do we remind people and business that we actually have more in common than we don't, and that it's in everybody's interest to act?
Well, I think by never forgetting that we are all human beings who share the one planet and who have the same destiny. We're born and we die, and in between that we live. And the aim is to live the best possible lives that we can and to help other people to do the same. And I think if you believe that and you feel it yourself, and it goes beyond yourself, beyond your family, beyond your immediate community, beyond your society, that it really, you keep pushing out to see what does that really mean. You won't go very far wrong with that. You really won't. You might do things that are not great some of the time, but you'll always be humane. And you will always know when you're not doing the right thing, and you will always say sorry for it. I really think that, I don't know, maybe I'm very naive. I'm nearly 80, but it's still there, that human beings fundamentally have to be given the chance to be our best selves. And that doesn't happen if you live in a way that's very difficult, impoverished, where there is abuse, where there's hatred. That doesn't happen. It's hard to live. You can't be your best self. It's really all our jobs, and particularly those of us who have a great deal of privilege, to be aware of that and to move over and to share what we have.
Ailbhe Smyth, thank you very much for challenging us today. To our listeners, the takeaway, I think, from this conversation is clear. The skills required to run a successful campaign, coalition building, active listening, holding the line against division, they're the exact same skills required to run a sustainable business in the 21st century. Silence in the face of division is really no longer a neutral stance. It is a decision. And through the Open for Business campaign, Ibec is asking you to make a different decision, to actively protect the diverse, open society that has allowed Ireland and our people and our broad population to succeed. I'm Cara McGann. This has been Courageous Leaders. Thank you for listening.